I'm Lee Petty from Double Fine. I've been nominated.
Don't mumble.
I wasn't mumbling, Steve. I've been nominated for it.
Like we, like not just I. You don't want to sound like you're like a big head. But...
All right. We, Double Fine, have been nominated for a 2012 Game Developers Choice Award. Watch it live on GameSpot on March 7th to see if Stacking won.
I agree.
No, it's Stacking.
Really? That's weird.
Almost coordinated.
All right. Even with it a little bit off, it should work out very well. So we'll do like a normal introduction here. Hello to people who might not know who I am or even who my guest will be. I am Heather Alexandra. I am the content and community manager here at Double Fine. I make videos. I run the social channel. It's a lot of weird stuff. It's a fun job. Today, however, I get to talk to somebody who I genuinely have always a wonderful time talking to, and that is Lee Petty. Say hello to the world, Lee.
Hey, hi everyone. Thanks for the nice introduction, Heather.
I do my best. So on the off chance that we have people who are listening who maybe don't have as much working familiarity with all of Double Fine's catalog or anything like that, can you tell people what your title is currently, and then we'll move on to the meat of what today is about, which is the 10-year anniversary of Stacking.
Yes, so I've been at Double Fine for 13 years, and a little over 13 years actually, and my title kind of vacillates between art director and project lead depending on what I'm doing at the moment. So
yes.
Both, I guess.
We are a company where people can wear a lot of different hats, which I guess is as good a segue as any to bring us into the thing to talk about, which is Stacking, which on Monday, today we are recording on a Friday, on Monday it will be the 10-year anniversary of its release. For those of you who maybe don't know how that process initially came about, and you can correct me on some of this, Lee, is we have a process here at Double Fine called Amnesia Fortnight, where we kind of put everything on hold for about 2 weeks, and people from any department all over the studio can pitch their game ideas. And they get turned into prototypes, and sometimes those prototypes get turned into games. And if I'm not mistakenly, that AF with Stacking might have been maybe like actually the first Amnesia Fortnight?
It was actually the second.
The second.
Yeah. So pretty close to the OG Amnesia Fortnight. I missed the original Amnesia Fortnight, the first one that was done at the company. I missed it by like 2 weeks or 3 weeks, something like that. I started just after it. And then everyone's like, yeah, we just did this new thing called Amnesia Fortnight. Too bad you missed it. I'm like, oh, thanks.
Oh, such a bummer.
Yeah.
Then you were off to the content mines doing Lord knows what.
Yes.
So for AF then, I want to ask you, because I think it's such an interesting process to go from what is essentially pitching a prototype to getting that made to, having that become a game which was very well received. So to start off, I was wondering if you could walk me through how you came up with your initial idea for your pitch, if there were any major differences at the time that you think folks should be aware of, and maybe if you could walk me through what that process was like a little bit, because I haven't been around for any Amnesia Fortnights at all.
Yeah, I think Amnesia Fortnight has changed quite a bit over time.
Sure.
And back then, it wasn't public, so we didn't talk about doing them outside of the company, and we didn't show them to anyone outside of the company. And it really wasn't thought of as like these would one day be real projects. That was not the purpose at all of Amnesia Fortnight at the time, because we were all working on Brutal Legend, and we did this Amnesia Fortnight that Stacking was in right at the tail end of right after we shipped, and so we were supposed to be starting Brutal Legend 2. So this was just a creative break. In between. And that's kind of what Tim's initial inspiration was for these, was kind of two things. One was a creative break when you're working on much longer projects, because Brutal Legend was over 4 years. And
right.
Also to allow, just to sort of discover and foster growth within the studio, people who might be interested in trying out project leadership on some level. So those were kind of the goals. We never really thought, like, so when I pitched stacking and thought of the idea, it was never necessarily with the intention to be a real project. Of course, I think every developer, artist always hopes that they get to do their own project one day, or at least lead a project, I should say. It's not one person's work.
Yeah, of course.
And but it really wasn't thought of it that way. And during that time, I think we've sort of had different processes each time Amnesia Fortnight is done in terms of how we select the game. Sometimes it's been like solely up to the public vote once it became public, and at this point, I think Tim just selected the ideas. So I had been having an ongoing conversation with Tim off and on for, I don't know, about a year, telling him that I was really interested in doing a smaller game, because they're really, when I first started talking to Tim, like Xbox Live Arcade was kind of a new thing, and most of the early games were really quite simple. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. They just weren't, there was like usually one person, and they were wasn't like a full development effort. And
no, it was like a really nice platform, because that's one of the few places that I worked on a game that got launched on XBLA Arcade and whatever. Right? That's not even around anymore, right? They don't even have that subsection for those kind of small things now. It's all kind of one big.
It is. It's just kind of one big thing. I mean,
big lump store, which is fine. It's fine.
Well, yeah, because back then, too, downloadable games was a new thing. I mean, I remember stacking won a few awards that were in the category of like best downloadable game, which is a comical thing to say now, right? So yeah, I had been having a conversation about some ideas I had, and I think around that time is when I think some of the early games that came out that did well that I was interested in. I think Limbo, they might have come out during Stacking's development or just before. I can't remember, but like Limbo and Braid came out, and so it was interesting to see things that were made by like slightly larger teams, and in some cases, quite polished or developed visually. And I thought that would be, I don't know, it's kind of a space I always wanted to work in. So anyways, I've been just talking to Tim about a variety of ideas, and I knew I kind of wanted to do something adventure game-esque.
Right.
I'll call it that. I didn't really think of the adventure game framework when coming up with the idea for stacking, but I worked at Double Fine and Tim's history with adventure games, and I think many of our fans are adventure game antiquarians. So I thought this would be it'd be a neat space to explore. And I actually started thinking of the game. I might be getting ahead of this, but I'll just sort of say
go for it.
I started thinking of stacking as in kind of deconstructing adventure games, things I didn't like about adventure games, and I was like, well, or maybe didn't like is a weird word.
Well, that's fine, but I'll pause you right there to put you on the spot. Sorry to interrupt. I'll say this then. What is the thing about adventure games that you dislike the most? Let me throw you a curveball right away.
Yeah. Well, I think, and maybe it's not the thing I dislike the most, but I think the things from both having developed adventure games since and before, I think the thing that always winds up catching up, always is really hard, is that puzzles, fundamentally adventure games work on kind of a logic puzzle chain, and it's not it's not like, say, if you have a game that's based on physics puzzles, the player can do a lot of testing and failing and learn information, and that's much harder to do with adventure games, because there tends to be this sort of particular frame of mind, and it's really hard to get players into a particular frame of mind or a thought chain without just tipping your hand completely. So and so I was like, well, it'd be nice to systematize that somehow, but not drain it of all the personality. And then I was like, well, we can just do multiple solutions to every puzzle. And
right, because the problem that you sometimes can run into with adventure games is that you get locked into the chain of the puzzles, right? You get the one thing that leads to the other, that leads to the other. There's a certain degree in which I think adventure games, they're great kind of on that first time around for kind of teasing your mind, but you're sort of locked into a linear sequence of brain teasing. So the idea of maybe being able to explore a level using different tools or things like that, or in the case of stacking, it's a lot of in theory, right, like using disguises or things like that to be able to navigate spaces too, right, which is very different than just getting the right widget to go into the sprocket, even though there is a degree of overlap on the most basic of verbiage levels.
Yeah, and I, and it just seemed like, you always talk about that sort of stuff, when you're making games, adventure games or not, which is like, oh, it'd be great if the player could do this multiple ways, or we could have multiple versions, and it's always so challenging because it's so difficult to make any single version of the game, even if it was 100% linear, which most games aren't, but even if they were, even that is extremely challenging, because you still have like player navigation and user controlled cameras, so it makes even the most like structured experience still very nonlinear by comparison to most other mediums. So it's challenging. So I think the interesting thing was when I started thinking of, I don't know, it's kind of hard to dissect which pieces of the idea came first, but
yeah, of course.
I knew that I had imagined this weird, I was initially like really into this concept of like a diorama world and stop motion worlds and, tilt shift photography, which was kind of new at the time. And I definitely remembered thinking about the Brothers Quay animated stop motion stuff that was done in the 90s, I think it was.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And it's super weird stuff and really abstract in a lot of ways, but lovely work. And I was like, well, it'd be cool to be in a world like that. And then when I started thinking about like, well, what do you do? I always think of like the style and the world building and the verbs all at the same time when I try to come up with game ideas. I like them all to be very cohesive and feed into each other. And so I got into the idea of a stacking doll and the idea of collapsing inventory to what you are. So there's no separate inventory like there is in an adventure game where you're a character and there's inventory, where the characters were the inventory. And somehow like the idea of a painted wooden doll fed into this kind of diorama world I was thinking about. And then that, that all kind of worked together with multiple solutions, because when the dolls that you're controlling and playing as are also the verbs you use to solve the puzzles, and the dolls are simple to make, I could make we had like 150 characters in that game. Well, okay, for a game that we made in 11 months, which is all the time we had to make stacking, like that would be insane if those were like articulated human-esque characters, So it kind of worked out, but it's hard to dissect how that idea flowed together. But I think when I talked with Tim in my initial pitch, I was just like, I want to make a game where you're changing identities effectively because you're playing these different characters and you're going from small to large characters and maybe seeing different aspects of this world and you're progressing a story or something like that. It was very high level abstract. I didn't kind of get in, a lot of this other stuff flowed out as I developed the idea, and I think Tim was.
There's a certain through line to that though, because I think I've mentioned this to you before. Because when I think of, some of the projects that you've been involved with, I also think of something like Headlander, where that is also a game to a certain extent about adjusting your body, taking on roles, and using those as ways to solve puzzles too. It's obviously in a different genre and a different framework and a different perspective, but I mean, I think there are definitely things where I can go, oh, that's Lee. That's definitely Lee. and I think stacking, not now that we've had the benefit of, once again, a decade and even more to kind of see that. It's interesting to see, at least in my mind, especially as somebody new who's catching up with some things in the studio, looking back and going, oh, this is the kernel of something to a certain extent, which I think is really, really cool, because I think if I can verge on being, very complimentary, I mean, there are definitely ways in which I go, oh, that's Lee Petty, right? And that's expressed not just in your artwork, which has always been very distinct, but also sometimes in the mechanics that you choose, in the projects that you end up leading or pitching.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's you go through this weird identity crisis a bit when you're sort of when you're developing a body of work, let's say for a gallery, like you're painting or something, you develop this body of work, and a lot of that is, like you want that particular show, that particular body of work to have its own identity, but you also want it to kind of speak perhaps to who you are or the concerns that you're exploring as an artist over the course of your life. But sometimes you're always questioning, like, am I just doing the same thing again? Am I stuck in a rut? So you're always like in the game where you're looking for areas to push into new areas, but then you're also trying to like hold on to those things that are your concerns. And
please don't think I'm implying through what I said there that I go, oh, Lee Petty stays the same and does nothing. That's not true at all.
No, I
That's
didn't think that.
100% not true at all.
I didn't think that at all. I just was like, that's
good.
sort of the thought process going through my head. And
it's a creative anxiety for sure, right? It's the same way that, when I was doing writing or journalism or things where I was worried about, it's slightly different, but the way that my sentences sounded, right? Like there were ways in which that, not to distract too much, but there were ways in which I started to understand how I wrote or how I talked that was very excuse me, the dog is barking in my throat, just did a thing. But there are ways in which it was very identifiably me, and you want that because it's a core aspect of you, but you also want to iterate on that and change that depending on who you are in the moment, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And I think, it's interesting, and you look for those through lines, and then you figure out like, how can I better explore that through line, too, like for future work. So, I jokingly, I think at one point someone was asking me why I kept making, or why I was interested in games about like changing identity and stuff, and I was like, well. I was like, I'm sure it's just my Gen X existential angst, like kind of growing up in where I was convinced nuclear war was going to happen any day. And
don't worry, my generation's totally convinced about that too. So we have a common point.
Absolutely, but like that like having experienced that young age, like you really, and it's already part of like growing up is to kind of question your identity and all that. I just feel like I've never quite got out of that. And the thing that's really interesting about games is when you're watching a movie, like you definitely movies are amazing, or reading a novel, and you're reading, you can definitely read or something about someone else's perspective, but it is interesting in a game to I wouldn't say like the fundamental point of stacking is to like make you see things through other people's eyes, because I'm more interested in games that aren't overly didactic, that actually play with subtext, which I realize is not as popular in the meta-modernist world as it is in my mind.
Not anymore. Not
right?
In the postmodern era, no.
Right, but I like nuance, and so I like nuance and I like contradiction. So I like lowbrow and highbrow things living together as well. So I think, with stacking though, like you wind up getting a little bit of that, whereas like each character that you're in has a different ability. And a lot of times they are just comedic abilities or things tied into puzzle solving, but they're also tied into the character, which in stacking, we kind of organize the world, because I really love world building and thinking about how this absurd world could exist. And I think, it was all based on doll size. It was all based on social order. And if you look at the small dolls that you wind up playing aren't only the children or the kids or the animals, they're also like the people digging coal or the people like the handymen. And like the biggest dolls are always these like, stewards of industry and stuff like that you wind up stacking into. And so it's interesting, and the abilities kind of reflect that too. Like to some extent, the bigger the dolls, the more trivial their ability is. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the smallest doll in the world who ends up making the biggest difference, right? And I was
just going to interrupt before we get too far ahead. I actually had two questions kind of on that point then, which is the first. The first one is, was there ever a period where that setting wasn't in place and you had explored maybe something that wasn't quite so explicitly like industrial at first, or was that always something that you think was kind of a linchpin in terms of the world that you were building? Because I've talked with people who have started with games that were going to be about trains and ended up being about pirate ships or whatever. So I'm curious to know if there was ever a moment early on where you thought you were going to go one direction instead of the direction that you went.
Yeah, I think there were two two times where a couple things shifted. So the very first Amnesia Fortnight version was set in the train station, and we wound up
Yes.
kind of using that location for the final game. I mean, it changed a lot, but and so there was definitely like, for some reason, I was definitely initially into this sort of more Victorian take with these Russian dolls, and I think part of that was because I didn't want to explain the world. You know, I was sort of like was telling Tim earlier, like I want to make more of like to put it in Pixar terms, more of a Monsters Inc. and less of a Toy Story. Like Toy Story,
Sure.
the toys that come, awake, and Monsters Inc. just kind of live parallel in this metaphorical world that's not explained, right? At least initially. And so, and because of that, I thought, well, the Victorian thing is interesting. I don't know. I'm a big fan of Dickens and all that, and I know I wanted to talk about class, so
Yes.
that made sense, right? And I wasn't as interested, and I thought if I was doing stuff like based in Russian mythology, it'd be really on the nose and would never kind of get out of that, even though I love a lot of those Russian fairy tales. So that was one thing that I did consider after Amnesia Fortnight, and I did do some concept development on. I did actually like a Baba Yaga hut as seen through stacking, and I had this mission. I had a level right up mission that was exploring these sort of different knights and princess that, I mean, of course they're pretty old fairy tales, so they tend to hang around in archetypes that I'm not like super into, but they're still like really interesting visually, because you'd have like really strange things like a city on the back of a whale, and going into the underground, the Russian underground, which involves these princesses that are made of various precious metals, and so there's some weird stuff in there that was appealing, but I just ultimately thought it just wasn't quite right for the game, even though I think it was a more interesting, or not more interesting, it'd be an easier first read. It'd be easy to say, experience a world of Russian mythology, and people are like, it would be easier.
The magical beast of Bubble. Exactly.
Yeah, right. But I was like, I don't know. It's not. I like dissonance. I like things that don't feel like they belong together, and then they suddenly, like, after you play it or experience for a while, you're like, I can only think of it this way now.
There's definitely aspects of that where I could see where some degree of class stuff could come into place in terms of social order of knights and all that sort of stuff. But I think if class was something that you were more explicitly concerned with, which sounds like the case, then moving over to Victorian, industrial, Dickensian makes that a lot more easier too. Probably gives you a lot more potential types of dolls too. Train conductors and janitors and all that sort of stuff too.
Well, it's interesting too, because in the Amnesia Fortnight thing, I had, because you're just doing it really quick, right? Like,
right.
2 weeks. I hadn't thought of like who's the protagonist. So there was no smallest doll. There was no like family of chimney sweeps. None of that existed in the Amnesia Fortnight or in my head.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so what's interesting is in the prototype, when you stack all the way down to what would become the smallest doll, you were like this flying ghost. It was just like a little glowing orb. And that was in there. And then I remember talking, we did the Amnesia Fortnight. You didn't see it too often because most of the time you're in dolls, but it was there. And I remember at one point I had to write some stuff, and I was working. Eric, who he was a lead designer at Psychonauts and Brutal Legend, who no longer works at Double Fine, but he was on the project in Amnesia Fortnight, and I was talking with him, and he was coming up with like different end cards. So like depending, even in the Amnesia Fortnight, even though we only had a single solution to the puzzle, we had multiple solutions, but they weren't acknowledged. The game would just accept them, and then, but based on various actions you had done, you'd get a different end story card at the end of the Amnesia Fortnight.
Right.
And he was writing those, and he was asking me about tone, and he's like, well, could you write some dialogue for the dolls to have, so I could sort of see what it is. And I don't even remember if we got the dialogue in the game. And I wrote all this dialogue, and it was all about, a lot of the dialogue had this satirical tone about people who were just impressed with the modern age of industrial wonder. And it was almost just because, it was ridiculous. It was like, can you believe that, they are making allowances for 3-minute lunch meals, was this stuff. And I think probably that's a reaction to living in the Silicon Valley, right?
I was going to say, you can't see it. I took my glasses off and rubbed my eyes because I'm also like, the way that you say that, I also go like, Man, there are like people out there who stan Tesla and like go insane about like, oh, this now we're in another new age of modernity or whatever. So
Yeah.
the way that you're phrasing that, my immediate response was like, oh gosh, it's like second verse, same as the first, a little bit.
Yeah, very much so, right? And
Yeah.
I think that was also like I remember even riding in the final game. You get to the third level, and you're finally on it's the name of the level is the triple decker tank engine, and there's a lot of like really the largest dolls, so these really wealthy, useless dolls, and
Yes.
they. I remember the time like free to play was big, and all those free to play games at the time were super corrupt and terrible, and everyone was saying how great they are, and we don't have to go by intuition anymore. We have data. I'm like, yeah, we can just throw out art and use spreadsheets. Great. So that was the vibe at the time. So I have a lot of their dialogue reflecting that in sort of Victorian terms. And I just remember enjoying that too much. But anyways, I'm getting sidetracked. But I wrote
No,
that
it's fine.
I wrote that dialogue, and in writing it, I realized how much I was into using this industrial revolution sort of thought process, and I remember really hamming up the pseudo-Victorian diction in it because I was it just sort of was evoking like all of the sort of like tech terms that people use,
Yeah.
and people are like, oh, it's the ARPU and the blah blah, and I was like, oh, this will be funny, I'll just like, so I remember just endlessly looking up antiquated terms for things that might have been used in the Victorian and hamming it up, and
That's always fun.
yeah.
I was going to joke earlier when you were talking about there being no littlest doll and just being a ghost. I was like, oh, that's the specter that's haunting Europe. Ooh,
There you
that's
are.
what that is. That's the specter of communism. No, I don't know.
That's
It's very
right.
funny. I actually did want to follow up and ask another question because we were talking about art style just for a brief second, which was, how did it feel going off of Brutal into something like this? Right? Was that like a kind of a breath of fresh air? Right? Because as I understand it, initially, sometimes the way that Tim has explained it is, everybody had been in the middle of heavy metal and demons and all sorts of stuff for a while, which is cool. Heavy metal and demons, I want to say for the record, 100% for them. But I'd be curious to know. I almost did like a foghorn leghorn there for a second too. I'd be curious to know, were you in the study when they were murdered? How did that feel? How did that kind of that shift into a different world feel for you personally, just as a creative?
Yeah, I mean, I really like it. I mean, obviously I have certain stylistic bents to various work I do, but I would like to
Yes.
think I'm pretty versatile with the sort of art styles I can do.
For sure.
And I like really thinking about the project. Like, I really have always disliked historically working in games and people see art as decoration. And to
Yeah.
me, like, form is content. Like, it communicates as much as the as the explicit narrative and as much as mechanics. And ideally, you want them all aligned. So I think about all those things at the same time when designing an art style, not just trying to make something appealing or because I like drawing uneven lines.
Right. It is one of the things that helps define function. Right.
Absolutely, you're right. It is function, right? And so I think with this game, I was, it was a shift, right? Because it was, I guess I always have an emphasis on color in all the games I art direct. I like color a lot, but it was definitely more of a sepia tone color and moving away from Brutal Legends, like over the top sort of bombastic effects. These are like low key, and one of the things I always love is line, and it's really hard to get line in games. Usually when you see line expressed in games, it's like, oh, we've done a cell shading, and then it's not really the hand of the artist that you're seeing expressed. You're seeing like, a 3D model that's been keylined by a renderer.
It's like programmatic or things like that.
And so, one of the nice things about the dolls is like they basically were the same cylindrical shape, and all of their ornamentation was done through line. And I knew that because the world was simpler, we could have, like, for the time, relatively high resolution textures, and we could actually have ink lines in those textures and have them read. And so that was like one of the foundations of the style, and that was very different than Brutal Legend, and the color usage was different. And I think kind of one of the things that I think I put in initially, and I wasn't really thinking it'd be a dominant part of the visuals, but it actually became pretty important as the game developed, which was I think because I had originally in the back of mind all these diorama stuff, I started introducing some some scale objects, like maybe from the human world, that were just incorporated. So and that was even in the Amnesia Fortnight. So it might be, I don't remember what it was. It was something like, oh, there's a table, but it's a quarter, or like there's the wheels of the train and they're toothpicks or something like that. And I think it's just because I had that diorama stuff in the back of my head. And then the world, when we started actually making the game, the environment artists were like, "Oh man, we got to do more of this." And I was like, "Oh well, let's not do too much. I don't want it. I don't want it to be like. I wanted it to inform the style, but I didn't want it to become the narrative content, in the sense that, like, if this was a game about papercraft would just be the framing of the world. It wouldn't be like a game about papercraft, you know. And so I was sort of in that world about those diorama objects, but they were really into it. So I was like, all right, let's do more of it. And then I really loved it. I really looked for excuses of where I could stick these little like human things, and it kind of gave it was kind of like an allusion to like some connection with human worlds. It wasn't quite so abstract, and it gave you some sense of scale along with sort of camera blur without it being ever having to be specifically said. So yeah, I don't know. That's, you know, those are sort of the things that come out of those conversations and that development that you know. Yeah.
So,
Yes.
there we go. We are back. Blah, 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 blah. There was a tech issue. I'm going to find a way to snip it all together. I'm sorry about that. What were we talking about? I panicked because there was a tech. This is the issue of working remote, is that for a minute I was afraid I had lost everything. And this had been such a really solid conversation. So where were we? What were we talking about? I lost it.
It was, you know, it was just pure genius, and now it's lost forever. And
no, I don't know if that's true. Actually, you know what? I did have a question, which was, you know, perhaps I'm wrong, but I mean, I've talked with you before about the extent of some of the work that you've done before, Double Fine, working on different properties and things like that. But I actually wanted to know then, you know, in terms of stacking both as an Amnesia Fortnight project and then something that got made later on, I wonder if you'd be able to tell us some of the lessons that you learned, you know, chiefly as a project leader on this on this wonderful endeavor that ended up being stacking.
yeah, I mean, you know, it was definitely. I've been in sort of art director and other like co-creative director roles and stuff
Right.
like that for a while. So, you know, wasn't inexperienced at management, but it was the first time that I had sort of run a team that size, which was a pretty small team. I think it was like 12 people, maybe a little bit more, you know, for pieces of the project.
Yes.
And definitely it was really stressful. Like, the team was wonderful and I really liked making the game, but man, I didn't sleep for like those 11 months. Like, I was just,
no,
you know, so stressed.
buddy. I'm so sorry.
No, it's part of, it's not anything the company did, and it's not a complaint. It's just like,
No, yeah.
you know, you want to do an amazing job. And I think the thing that I realized, and I knew this already, but it reminded me, is, you know, how sort of two sides of it, which is just that, like, it reminds you, like, I mean, I remember like always complaining about teachers, and then like I married a teacher, and then I realized that, like, you know, like, even teachers who you think are bad are still doing an enormous amount of work. And
Yeah.
it showed me how challenging it can be to do some of the core jobs of being the creative director and project lead, which is like trying to communicate, trying to move everyone in the same direction, and then trying to like foster collaboration and get shit done. And reach a vision, you know, and like those are all really hard things to do for anyone, and they can be stressful. So, you know, I think I grew over that project in that I became more comfortable doing some of those across multiple departments, and also the other side is you realize how much any project really relies on the talent of absolutely everyone working on it, and it's not
Yeah.
one person. And I think, you know, you can sometimes forget that a bit when you're working on like a giant team, because you don't see everyone's contributions directly as much, or you're not working with them. But when you're the one coordinating across all those departments, and you know what the goal is and what the timelines are, and you're trying to do the best job you can, you really are just like, oh man, thank God these people know what they're doing. And so it just is a good reminder on both sides. Like, okay, I'm the next time I'm working with another creative director, I'm really gonna have a better insight into, through their eyes, what that job is like, and maybe be a little more patient. And then
Yes.
At the same time, I'm gonna realize, like, it just reminds you how what a strange and collaborative process it is to make a game, and very different types of people from a skill set come together to make them. So I think it just kind of, I don't know, these weren't totally new revelations, but I feel like they reached an extra level of fidelity. And then something more, the other thing I learned, and I think this is a little harder to speak to in a specific way, which is just like, I remember telling Tim that, like, I'd been in games, I think by the time Stacking came out, I'd been in games already for like 15 years. And
Right.
I
You've
remember
done all sorts of stuff. I remember you told me you even worked on that Superman project, which I thought was like the coolest thing.
Yes, that's true. But I remember having the thought in my head and telling Tim, this is actually the first time in my career that I've actually felt like an artist making a game.
Really?
And I don't mean that in a specific, like, making art. Like, I made art plenty of times, but there's something about the experience to me that was the first time I felt like it was an actual artistic endeavor more than anything else. And so it was, thanks. It was just kind of how I felt, and at the time, and I don't know what exactly that was. Is I'm sure it was the team, the particular title, Tim's support, where it was in the history of downloadable things being kind of new, all that sort of stuff. But it had a big impact on me at the time.
I think it's a hard thing to find. I think, especially just in the games industry in general, whether that's, you're a streamer now and you're grinding out whatever you have to grind out on Twitch for views. If you're a writer at an outlet and you have to, cover news about something that you don't like, or if you're a designer or an artist and you're at a studio, if you're at a big place, right? If you're just at a place of like 300 blah 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 people, right? I think it's easy to feel like the processes that you're involved in are largely these large automated things. So I would hope that in the case of what you're saying, that part of that is being able to work on your project, which I'm sure must have been a great feeling, and then also being in a circumstance where, kind of like you were saying, where the team aspect is more readily available, right, and more readily understood. I think, I think about studios that are massive, right? Like Double Fine for us, it's like maybe like 70 something people, right? And then some of those things get broken up into smaller teams. And I think, if I can be so bold, even though I'm new and know nothing, that the small teams really help with that, right? It helps you feel like you're contributing to something very clearly that's before you, right? You can really see what the thing is every single day.
Yeah, there's an immediacy, I think.
Yeah.
They're challenging in very different ways than big projects are as well, but there is something overall I prefer to it, and I think part of it is when I was art directing larger projects, I had to be much more hands off, and I don't know, maybe it's my my family's blue collar roots or whatever, but I always I don't feel like I'm doing my job if my hands aren't dirty, and
Sure.
I know that's not right. Like, there are definitely, like, when you're a manager, that is absolutely a full-time job and then some. But I want this. There's part of me that just needs to keep my hands dirty in something, whether that's writing or level design or art creation or whatever. In addition to hopefully doing a good job leading, and I think for me that's much more satisfying on the scale of something like Stacking, because you can possibly do that.
Yeah, and I would say it's not a feeling of, feeling nervous about delegating or anything, especially if you have a good team and you're in a lead position. Delegating, you trust people and it's fine. But I think what you're speaking to is just, sometimes it just feels good to do a thing.
Yeah.
And sometimes the reality of design, especially direction, art direction, or things like that, means sometimes backing off. So being able to hop in and pull up your sleeves and do something that must be immediately there's an immediate gratification there that must be really fulfilling.
Yeah, it is. And you're right. It's not about delegation and trust. At least it isn't for me. I like to. I try. It's everyone has their own style, and no particular style is perfect. But I try, and for me, I feel like I need to answer questions to give people the context to then let them do the things they're working on the best. And the way that I can realize that context and those answers is by being super involved with it, and hopefully not, like second guessing or getting in people's faces all the time, but just like really, I think it's too easy to forget what it's like to have to make something yourself and be on a deadline. And I feel, for me, it feels like it keeps me relevant to always be making stuff. And, it's a tenuous balance between that and also, being a decent leader as well, which is another full-time job. But
yes. And then the third thing on top of that of just being a person, finding time for yourself. Doing that good stuff. That's the one that gets lost in the shuffle the most, I feel like.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. Yep. That's absolutely true.
We're winding down because we have a little bit of a company meeting here. I wanted to just in a vague sense, which is something that I do with a lot of interviews or things like that, is to kind of hand over closing statements to you to just anything you wanna say about stacking. If anything you want to say about this anniversary, 10 years is such a long time. It's not a long time. 10 years in the grand scheme of things, it's actually pretty short, but it still feels, it's like such a different time ago. So, kind of turning the floor over to you in terms of any closing thoughts you wanted to share about stacking.
Yeah, it's hard to think it's been 10 years, right? It is a long time. A lot has changed in 10 years in the world and in games and everything else. But I have a hard time playing my own games and feeling proud about the work I do. It's just who I am as an artist.
Sure.
And so it takes me many years, some distance before I can actually look at things and think I didn't fuck everything up. So, I think 10 years is about enough. I can look at stacking and I'm pretty proud of it. And I was really proud of working with the team. It was a great team, and everyone, everyone really contributed to it. And I remember, even though we had like pretty tight deadlines and not a lot of time, I remember everyone just I don't know, I felt like we really held together well as a team, and everyone added a ton of themselves to the game. And I was really happy to have worked on it, and fortunate to have been given the opportunity to lead a project. And without going into a long story, I think the only reason stacking ever became a reality is because Brutal Legend 2 was canceled. And
that is a longer story. Yeah,
it is a longer story, but it just goes to show you never know where opportunities are going to come from. And it's I think opportunity is more about luck than anything else, but it's also about being in having the right attitude or skills and people if that luck happens to come your way. So I was lucky to have like a great team that we had already worked together some on Brutal Legend and ready to go, and we happened to get the opportunity, and it was great. And I think I always look back on, other than a sleepless year of my life, it was fantastic. So yeah, thank you.
That's still good. I'm so happy for you. I'm so happy for the team. It's a game that, when fans approach me as they do for all sorts of stuff, most of it good, they ask me about stacking. They always ask about, they ask about sequels for everything, but stacking 2 comes up a lot. I have a lot of people who tell me that they like playing stacking as a game now, especially because we're all getting older and the march of time is a thing that they can very easily introduce to their kids to get them into exploration and puzzle stuff and things like that. So, super good job, super well done to you and to the team. And here's to another 10 years. I'll talk to you in 10 years. I'll never talk to you except 10 years from now when we talk about Stacking's 20th anniversary.
That's right. I might have very little memory and false teeth by then, but I'll do my best.
That'll be good. Thank you so much, Lee. Sorry about that little tech hiccup. And that'll be that. And
Thank you.
thank you,
That's fun.
everybody, for listening. And have a wonderful day.
Thanks for playing.
Thank you, Lee. Sorry about that.
No problem. So, okay. I'm gonna hit stop.